Sometimes when you're filming a video for YouTube, the location is just as interesting as the subject. Do you recognize this place? As I said, there are quite a few photographs online of this area, and this area is known locally as Meg's Wood. And it may be the only genuinely documented place where a revenant has walked the earth. Oh, if English isn't your first language, a revenant is someone who has died or thought to have died, and then they came back to life. Even if you don't know the name of this place, as soon as you arrive, you'd know that something was wrong. Just looking around at the trees behind me all over, this will tell you that something is not right here. You know, the trees are all bent and twisted. And although the story itself was terrifying for everyone involved, it ends, strangely, on a note of hope, thanks to an unlikely intervention from King Charles II, who had recently been restored to the throne, I think, in 1660. So I'll explain about Meg's Wood. Margaret Halsall was her name, and she was known as Old Meg, and she was a very poor elderly woman who lived alone in this patch of woodland around 400 years ago, so that's in the mid-1600s. She scraped together a living mixing and selling herbal remedies. This was old knowledge of roots and herbs and teas, the kind of thing that's passed down through the generations. Her potions often worked better than the bleeding and the blistering favoured by doctors at the time, but they also made people very nervous, and at that time this was a very dangerous situation for Margaret to be in. This was post-Civil War England, and the witch trials were still going strong, especially in the north, and people were frightened. Anything odd or unexplained was to be feared, and Meg, well, Meg was odd. She lived alone in a forest. People said that she talked to plants, and she'd outlived 3 husbands. So when she fell ill one April morning in 1661, no one looked too closely. The local doctor was called. He touched her neck and checked her breathing, and she was rigid and had no pulse, so she was declared dead. The villagers were afraid that her spirit might linger, and they wanted her buried as soon as possible. But because of her reputation, the local priest denied her the right to be buried in the churchyard, in consecrated ground. So she was wrapped in a burial shroud and just buried in the ground right here in this patch of forest, in a shallow grave beneath these trees. The trees in this area grow very slowly, and many of the trees you can see behind me are more than 400 years old. So her grave could have been directly underneath any one of these trees. In those days, medical schools were desperate for bodies to dissect so they could study anatomy. But the legal supply was limited, so grave robbing, especially ones that nobody would miss, it was widespread. And after midnight, 2 days after her burial, 2 body snatchers, I'm trying to remember their names, Thomas Pike and William Hargreaves, they arrived to dig up Meg's body and to collect what they thought would be an easy prize. But as they dug, just as the final layers of mud were being cleared from the top of the coffin, a bloodied hand punched up through the wood and soil, followed by another. Margaret had woken shortly after her burial, and she'd been alone in the dark in her coffin. She'd clawed at the planks above her. Her nails were torn away. Her skin was shredded. She'd spent nearly 2 full days trapped underground, fighting to get out. And now, by sheer will or luck, she broke through. And as she scrambled out of the grave, her head and face were cut and splintered by the wood of her coffin. The 2 grave robbers, Thomas and William, were faced by a true dead person standing in front of them, covered in blood and soil, dressed only in a burial shroud that was hanging off her like seaweed. And as you would, Margaret started screaming as she walked towards them. William Hargreaves fell backwards and cracked his head on a rock, and he died instantly. Thomas Pike, as he would later tell the magistrate, just stood rooted to the spot, frozen, and began reciting the Lord's Prayer over and over again as Margaret ran away screaming into the woods. Terrified and disorientated, she staggered back to the village and started pounding on the doors in the middle of the night. But when the villagers opened their windows and saw her, mud-caked, covered in blood, almost naked except for a bloody burial shroud, well, they didn't see an old woman who needed help. They saw a ghost, a witch, a revenant, and they panicked. To them, she wasn't Margaret anymore. She was proof that the world could twist itself inside out, that the dead could rise, and that the guilt about what they'd done to her would come pounding, onto their doors in the middle of the night. The villagers panicked. Men grabbed pitchforks and clubs and anything else they could find to attack this walking spirit. And they dragged poor Margaret into the village square and beat her unconscious, and then shoved her into an empty barrel and nailed the lid shut. The next day, the barrel, with Margaret still inside it, was taken to Lancaster, where she was put on trial for witchcraft. Oh, just on this point, by the way, in England there was a law passed in, I think it was 1541, I'm trying to remember the name. It was called the Act Against Conjugation, Witchcraft, Sorcery and Enchantment. But this law didn't make all types of magic illegal, just magic which did damage. And the reason for this is that some types of magic, like Margaret's herbal remedies, were seen as good for the community. But later, I think it was in 1603, there was another law called the Witchcraft Act. It was passed in England, and this clearly defined all types of witchcraft as being demonic and evil in nature. So also the 1603 Act made magic a criminal act, and so the responsibility for the trials was taken away from the church, and they were these trials were handled in the criminal court in the same way as all other crimes. And just as a footnote, the 1603 Act also said that being a revenant, someone returning from the dead, was illegal. The reason for this is that it would cause legal chaos. As an example, if somebody died and then later returned, who owned their property now? What would happen if their wife or their husband had remarried? Could the living be found guilty of a crime of bigamy due to the act of a dead person? Would a revenant still be responsible for their debts, etc., etc.? So the basic idea was that once you were dead, you better stay dead. And if you didn't, you were committing a crime by returning. And the punishment for this crime was death. Anyway, as was normal in witchcraft trials, the court was very swift, and Margaret was found guilty, and of course she was sentenced to death. Again. The next morning, Margaret was tied to a stake and surrounded by piles of wood, and she was to be burnt at the stake. And the wood was lit, and the flames started. But just then, a sudden violent rainstorm swept in, so fierce that it put out the fire in seconds. The crowd will have fallen silent, will have looked at each other and looked at the sky. The magistrate would have hesitated, and they all would have whispered that this was an act of God. So Margaret was cut down and returned to her cell. Now, word of what happened travelled fast, and it soon reached London and the court of the newly restored King Charles II. We can't really say what the king thought of this, as the court records only use the Latin word capio, which can be roughly translated as captivated, or that's both animated and amused, or intrigued. It's this court record which I mentioned at the start. Here we have the only legal document in English history detailing what was to be done by a person who was dead, but now wasn't, a true revenant. The king may have just been embarrassed by the whole mess. We'll never know. But as he said, that in his opinion, the rainstorm was obviously an act of God. And in those days, the king's word was law. The king ordered that Margaret, who was dead, now wasn't dead. That was his order. And she should be spared and sent to a nunnery where she could live out her days in peace and prayer. She lived there for another 12 years before passing away quietly in her sleep. But one of her last requests was that she should be reburied again in these woods, which now and will forever be named after her. This time when she was buried, she stayed buried. Just a final point. In these modern times, we can ask, was Margaret truly a revenant? Did she really die and then come back to life? Who knows? Okay, now we understand the medical condition called catalepsy, but she may have suffered from that. But whatever the truth, these trees, which you can see behind me, bent and twisted, as if they're reaching down towards the ground to help somebody escape from below, well, they're the only things still alive that actually witnessed what happened on that night. And like trees all over the world, they're keeping quiet about what they know. Anyway, I hope you now know all about the silver Neo compass. I'll have a couple. Packed lunch today, by the way. Normally, the sandwiches are the highlight of my packed lunch. Sandwiches today are gammon, cream cheese, and some pickle. Very plain. But the highlight of my packed lunch today are these. I don't know if you know what they are. These are flapjacks. This particular one, this is coconut and treacle, baked by my wife yesterday. And if you're ever in this area, just knock on our front door, and ask my wife for some of her coconut and treacle flapjacks. They're really, really good.